that, I will turn it over to you, Katie, to moderate today's session.
Thank you, Grant. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2022 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. My name is Katie Parker, and I work as a local foods and small farms educator for Adams, Brown, Hancock, Pike, and Schuyler counties, and I'm your moderator for today's session. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we will do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. Due to that time restriction, we do ask that you put any questions in the chat box during the presentation, and we'll do our best to make sure all the questions are answered at the end of the presentation. So this week's presentation is from Doug Guger. Doug is a local food systems and small farms educator with University of Illinois Extension, housed in Decatur. He improves producer profitability and sustainability through demonstration and programming focused on using appropriate management strategies in all aspects of production. His work demonstrates practices in the areas of farm management, soil health, nutrient management, integrated pest management, and grazing. Doug's other interests are agriculture entrepreneurship, beekeeping, cover crops, native prairie restoration, water quality with regard to agriculture, urban farming systems, local foods, gardening, and pawpaws. Doug has a bachelor's degree in biology and agronomy and a master's degree in agronomy. He is an Illinois certified crop advisor. His professional affiliations include the American Society of Agronomy, National Association of County Agricultural Agents, and the Soil Water Conservation Society, Illinois Forage and Grassland Council, and Epsilon Sigma Phi, a National Extension Professional Development Society. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Doug, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Katie. And here's my screen. I'm here in Central Illinois. We're currently having an ice storm, so hopefully I won't have any problems and we'll get through this hour just fine. So I'm going to talk about pawpaws. I, on a whim, when I retired from farming in 2010, I planted 15 pawpaw trees. And that was 2 years before the drought of 2012. And I have to say, I was very impressed. I only lost 3 trees during that episode, during that drought. So it truly is one of our native trees that's well adapted for our area. So what is the pawpaw? It is, as I said, it's one of our native fruit trees. It's found in the nice, richer, deeper soils in the eastern half of the United States and the more temperate areas, kind of in the central part of the eastern half of the country, and I mean central. It loves deep, rich, fertile soils, so it does well here in a good part of Illinois. It's typically found in nature in river bottom lands on the upslopes, just up from the bottom. It doesn't particularly like to be underwater particularly, but just up off the river bottoms where the soil is nice and moist, but yet well drained. As you can see from the map, it ranges from Florida to southern Ontario, pretty impressive. And it goes from the East Coast all the way over to eastern Nebraska before we get into the high plains and the drier climate out there. It can tolerate that. It's a slow growing, moderate size, pyramidal shaped tree. And it has very big leaves. To give you an idea, the pawpaws there that are hanging in the tree, they're 5 to 6 inches long, and that leaf is 12 inches long. It has very big leaves, something that's really quite unusual for us among Illinois native trees. So as it's a tropical fruit. In fact, it's the only temperate tropical fruit that's in North America. It's a member of the Ananaceae family, the custard apple family. This is a primitive fruit family dating back to prehistoric times. It's the largest edible native tree fruit in the United States, which is pretty amazing. And as I said before, it dates to prehistoric times. There have been fossils found that date back 3.5 to 23 million years here in the United States and in the central part of the United States. So it's been here a long time, and it has adapted over time from the tropical environment that was here 5 to 20 million years ago to our cooler, more temperate climate that we have today. The fruit, if you're not familiar, it can weigh up to 2 pounds, but typically it's in the 8 to 12 ounce range. Some of our newer varieties are producing 16 ounce fruit consistently. I'll talk about that a little later. The fruit is very fragrant. I mean, the flesh is very fragrant and aromatic, quite a complex flavor to it. When no two people will tell you what it tastes like, because we all taste something different. For me, I think it's kind of a combination of banana and mango and papaya. Some people taste a pineapple in it as well. The fruit, according to Kentucky State University, which has done the most research on pawpaws over the last 25 years and has analyzed it, it's high in antioxidants, the fruit is, which is great. The fruit tastes very good. The skin, however, is bitter tasting. So have to keep that in mind when you're processing. You don't want to get the skin in with the pulp or the flesh of the fruit. It's pollinated by flies, and that's what a blossom looks like. It's a pretty blossom, but it's a fragrant bloom, but you wouldn't want to wear it for a perfume because it does attract flies. However, there have been cases where some people are allergic to the fruit. And so we just have to keep that in mind as well. I have never personally seen anyone, but there are reports of it. And so Kentucky State has talked about this, mentioned this quite a bit, as have the National Pawpaw Growers Association. So some of the desirable traits that we're looking for, if you notice those seeds there, those are seeds from my older pawpaw varieties. And as you can see, they're over an inch long. The pawpaw has big seeds. We're breeding and getting the seed size smaller. I mean, they are, the researchers are, the nurserymen are. But ideally, with the new varieties that we have coming out, we're looking for a high flesh to seed ratio, which makes it easier for processing. These big seeds are hard to separate out mechanically when we're processing. They also take up a lot of space. I mean, we want fruit pulp. We don't want seeds when we're raising fruit. So the other thing is that we're looking for fruit that's 10 ounces or larger. Once again, good tasting fruit, and with all the new varieties, that is the case. We don't have to worry about that with the new varieties that are out there now. We also want flesh that is firm and sweet, and seeds that are 3/4 of an inch or smaller that's going to help with the processing and also give us a higher yield of flesh, the fruit which we're looking for. So I mention it again, our new cultivars, our improved cultivars, they're being released by two groups. And the two groups have worked together in partnership from time to time. The Neil Peterson Nursery, Neil Peterson is a retired USDA statistician who grew up in West Virginia and had a love for pawpaws. And over his career as a hobby, he has developed and has as a business a pawpaw nursery. And they propagate new types of pawpaws and then release them to other nurseries to grow out. And their varieties, as you can see there, are Shenandoah, which has it's actually a little less than 6% seed to flesh ratio and nice large fruit. Rappahannock, that's one of the older, some of his older cultivars. Susquehanna and Potomac are two of his of their newest. As you can see, they have a low seed to flesh ratio and large fruit. Potomac, Susquehanna is 3%, Potomac is 4%. Potomac, they say, consistently raises 16-ounce fruit, and that's pretty impressive, I have to say. As well as Allegheny and Wabash, and they're all good. But as you can see, we have some new varieties that cultivars that show a lot of promise. They're also very hard to get. I think I have 2 Susquehannas coming this spring. We'll see. The other group that's working on this, as well as done initiated most all the pawpaw research in the United States, has been Kentucky State University. Dr. Kurt Pomper is in charge of it now, and his group has developed 3 pawpaw varieties, KSU Atwood, Benson, and Chappelle. It says 6%, but once again, it's less than 6%. But when you round it up, it's actually 5.8, 5.6, but round it up to 6. The Chappelle is their latest release, and it has nice fruit and also shows a lot of promise. Benson does too. Fruit's just a little smaller, but still good size in that 10 to 12 ounce range. So our older productive cultivars, and these are what I put out back in 2010. I didn't put out all of these. I just put out 5 of these, but they have large fruit, good flesh. The seed to flesh ratio is a little higher than we'd like, those big seeds that I showed you in my previous slide. But overlease, nice big fruit, good flavor. NC1, sunflower is one of our old selections. Mitchell, Taylor, T2, PA Golden, Pennsylvania Golden, and IXL. They're all good. You can find these cultivars easily from most nurseries, but once again, they have big seeds. They have good flavor, but big seeds. So comes to where do we plant these pawpaws? Well, ideally, we want deep, fertile, well-drained, moist soil. So here in the central part of the state where I'm located, that's not, the well-drained is an issue, but the moist soils and the deep, fertile soils aren't a problem. And so we just have to be careful. They don't like wet feet. As far as soil pH, they have a pretty good range. They really like it best in that 6 to 7, but they do grow at 5.5. It is key when you're putting out new trees that they're going to need to be watered for the first couple years until that their root systems get well established. After that, they do very well. I have them producing in droughts without any water. But if you're going to do this commercially and to raise them and raise consistently large quantities, it's recommended that you use drip irrigation. As far as planting, as I mentioned earlier, this in nature, they're found as an understory tree. So they will fruit in the shade, but by far we get our best production when they're out in full sun. Now, that being said, when we put out new plantings, they would like to have a little protection from the sun. And so shading is advised. That can be literally shading. Tree shelters can also provide that shading, but vented tree shelters are suggested, recommended to keep the temperature down in those tubes. And I can vouch for that. I've used ventilated and unventilated, and the unventilated on a July day, it gets quite warm inside those tubes. The other, once again, the irrigation. So that's not too bad. As you can see there, we also would like to keep a nice, keep the weed competition down from around the trees. We also want to provide some kind of shelter around them. In my area, I have a problem with rabbits and voles on my smooth bark trees, which pawpaws are a smooth bark tree. And so I use tree shelters, and I would recommend them because these trees are expensive to buy, and a tree shelter is pretty cheap in comparison to the cost of that tree that you're going to pay $25 to $50 for, depending what cultivar you get. As far as spacing out in the field or put in rows, we want kind of 6 to 8 feet between them, so we get some air circulation in the row between the trees in the row, and then the rows 15 to 18 feet apart, once again just to get nice air circulation. Trees can range up to 25 feet tall. Mine are all in the 15 to no higher than taller than 18 feet. So, and they're now 12 years old, so they're full grown. So they're a nice tree, good shape, very productive. As you can see, here's a picture of mine last fall. I caught it before the leaves fell. It was after pawpaw harvest. But as you can see, that tree is 15 feet tall, but those leaves you don't think the tree is as tall as it is because of these huge leaves on the tree. It really kind of dwarfs the tree when you look at the size of them. Again, the importance of irrigation the first 2 years, 1 inch of water a week. Kentucky State, as far as their recommendation for drip irrigation, is 2 emitters per tree, 1 gallon per hour at the rate. And they say that it'll take about 240 gallons per tree per year using irrigation. As far as fertility, they're a very forgiving tree. They don't require a lot of fertility. As you can see there, if you've got drip irrigation, you can use fertigation 3 times a year. Kentucky State makes their recommendation as far as ounces of N, but they use a balanced fertilizers. So you can take it there as you see it. For granular, once again, first 2 years 1 ounce, and then after that 2 ounces. Very forgiving, require very little fertility. 2 ounces per tree per year, very easy. And in our fertile soils, if you miss a year, where I live, it does not matter at all. The trees don't even notice. Pruning, as you can see, one of my last picture, I didn't prune my trees. It wasn't talked about back then. But for ease of picking, and I would say this is a good idea, you can remove the lower branches up 2 or 3 feet from the ground. So you have some ground clearance down there, a little easier to pick, a little easier to get in the tree. You can train them to the central leader type of fruit tree system. But according to Kentucky State University, that tends to reduce the productivity. And Dr. Pomper from Kentucky State has shared this picture that, as you can see, when they trained it to a central leader, the difference in growth in 6 years growth was quite dramatic between the tree at the left and the tree at the right. And so they really don't recommend any central leader pruning. They do recommend pruning it up the lower branches just to make it easier to pick. Pest issues. Being a native tree, the pawpaw doesn't have many pests at all. And in fact, research, once again from Kentucky State, has shown a diversity of natural, and Purdue has also done some research in this as well, a diversity of natural compounds that show pesticidal properties. And they're found not only in the fruit, but in the leaves, the bark, and the twigs. And so this is not a tree that's particularly liked by deer for browsing. They will browse it, but if there is something that with a better taste, they will eat it before they'll eat a pawpaw. This is also what makes the pawpaw very good candidate for organic fruit production, because it has so few pests. As you can see on that fruit there, there is a little bit of fruit blight on there, and that is the only issue that typically doesn't affect fruit quality. It's just a blemish on the exterior of the skin. There are some insect issues. The pawpaw peduncle borer, typically in most pawpaw plantings, it's not an issue. In fact, it helps to thin the crop down so that you get good sized fruit. I've had it, but once again, it hasn't been an issue for me. Just that does a nice job kind of thinning out some of the fruit. It hasn't become a problem, but we can control it with pyrethroids if it should become a problem, or pyrethrins. Another insect that likes the pawpaw is the zebra swallowtail butterfly. And here, the only issue that's been noted with that is if you're planting small seedlings. In other words, a pawpaw that only have a few leaves, well, this caterpillar larva can really devastate it and clean it off. But otherwise, they aren't really an issue, and unless you go looking for it, you won't find them. The other pawpaw webworm, I haven't had this problem, but down in Kentucky, they've had it occasionally, and it's a leaf roller that shows up in August or September as the fruit is getting close to ripe. And so that's where the issue shows up there. Once again, it can be controlled. You just need to watch for it. We have a new pest, new in the fact that it's new to the United States, first discovered in 1974 in South Carolina. The Asian ambrosia beetle, sometimes called the granulated ambrosia beetle. The beetle, as you can see in the lower part of the slide there, is magnified. The beetle is only 1/8 of an inch long. Tiny insects. They're borers. Eggs are laid in clusters, and the borers, the larvae all grow and feed as a group through the tree. So that's why the cavities in the tree would be larger than you might think. The exit hole for this little beetle is 2 millimeters. It's a perfectly round 2 millimeter hole. So that gives you an idea how small these beetles are. They have had some issue with this in Kentucky. It can be controlled, but once again, it has to be controlled with sprays before the larvae bore into the tree. This ambrosia beetle is an issue in all kinds of horticultural and ornamental trees, and it has been discovered in Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois as well. So it is here. It could be an issue, but it hasn't been so far. But once again, I don't have a large planting. If I had hundreds of trees, that might be a difference, might make a difference. But it can be controlled. Diseases, the leaf spots and the fruit spots. We used to call it Philostichia complex, but we now know that it's actually 3 different fungal disease organisms. Typically, the picture in the upper picture is what it will look like if you have it. It doesn't really cause a problem on the fruit typically. That picture was taken this year. The lower picture, however, there have been a year or two when it was very wet and some of the fruit may develop the spotting earlier in the season, wet July. And then as the fruit grows, those lesions, blight areas do not expand, and then the fruit cracks open. And so once again, this is a fruit that wouldn't do well to be sold fresh. And for processing, it takes a little more extra effort to work with it. Typically only a problem when we have high rainfall, high humidity. You can see when I took this picture, the leaves were wet, it had been raining. So that's part of the issue there that we just need to worry about, but typically not a big problem at all. So what are the disadvantages of the pawpaw? I call it the 2 Ps. The fruit is perishable and the processing. The fruit is easily bruised when it's ripe. It's also soft, so it has to be handled carefully. And unfortunately, so far, researchers have not been able to find a way to artificially ripen pawpaws. They haven't been successful with the typical ways of ripening fruit. So that's not a terrible issue, but it's something that we need to keep in mind when you're raising pawpaws. They have to be handled carefully. Also, if the pawpaws fall on the ground, they're going to be bruised. They just bruise that easily. And when they fall, they're typically ripe. I mean, dead ripe, ready to eat when they're that ripe. Processing, we have no commercial processors. It's the typical catch-22 with any kind of a new produce that's brought in. There's not enough produce to create a demand for a commercial processor to invest in processing the fruit. That being said, we do have some ways that we can do the processing, and I've done both ways. I call this mechanized. You can see the hand crank, but you can put a pulley on there and power it by an electric motor. They sell a pulley for this Weston, for this formerly known the Roma food strainer and sauce maker. However, you have to buy extra parts. You need to buy the grape spiral that is deeper than the typical tomato fruit spiral that comes with it, which is shallow, and won't allow the big pawpaw seeds to go through it. And then the second thing you need to do is get either the pumpkin or salsa screen. Those are the screens on the left and right there in the lower picture. That's the grape spiral there. There have been some people that have modified the grape spiral even further. They have, particularly down towards the end, they've ground off half of the spiral as it gets to the end, just allow the larger seeds to work their way through. The unfortunate thing with this process is it is quicker. I will agree, I have done it, but you lose a lot of pulp. You just can't get all the pulp with these big seeds moving through because the flesh can't get close enough to the screen to really be pressed through. So we only recover about a half of the pulp. Currently, I'm using a cone colander. It's a little slower, but I get a lot more pulp by doing it this way. And so that's quite helpful. With either process, there's still the hand process of getting the pulp out of the skin. As I said before, the skin is bitter tasting. We don't want to get that into the pulp when we're processing because it gives an off flavor, makes it not pleasant at all to eat. So with that being said, as far as processing, we split it in two. You can see the big seeds there. That's my variety, my older varieties. The newer varieties, the seeds are smaller and there aren't as many. But as you can see in that one, which is typical for me, I have quite a few seeds in with my pulp. I then take the spoon that you see there in the middle on that little cutting board, and I scoop out the pawpaw out of the shell, out of the skin. It comes out real easy. The skin, for the most part, is pretty tough. You could just put that spoon right up against it and just kind of scoop right around the curve of the skin and get the flesh out into either one piece or a couple of pieces out of each half. Once you do that, put it in, drop it into the colander. I do mine outside. Typically, it's just easier. I have more space. Our kitchen isn't real big, old farmhouse. And then use my pestle, working around several times in one direction, then several times in the opposite direction. And I end up really with there's still some pulp in there, but it's not near like what I had when I put it through my food strainer and sauce maker, the Weston Aroma. But it does take a little longer. And so you have to decide what you're going to do. Kentucky State, they use the Weston, have it on an electric motor, and they process hundreds of pounds a day with about 4 people, several people taking pulp out of the skins and one person just basically feeding it, feeding the pulp then into the sauce maker. So the pulp, when you get done, we use part of this for a recipe, for a cheesecake. That's why it has some spoon marks in it. It's going to be creamy and pale in color. It's also going to smell real good. It's a faint smell. It's a delicate smell. And that's part of the flavor of a pawpaw. It has a delicate, complex flavor. It's not a strong, overwhelming type of very strong kind of flavor. It's a very, as I think of it, it's kind of like a papaya or a ripe mango. It's just that type of a flavor, that type of a flavor profile. Very good. But the pawpaw really shines. I mean, it really does in recipes where there aren't competing flavors that overshadow them. And so pawpaw ice cream, Great. My wife loves pawpaw ice cream. It can also be made into sherbet. I don't do that. We make ice cream. Custards, creme brulees, it works real good in those as well. Have had those. Mousse, it works good in mousse. Once again, for something cool, if you're wanting something cool. Kentucky State and the National Pawpaw Growers Association, they're pushing hot sauces made with pawpaw, substituting pawpaw instead of a mango or papaya that we see in some of our tropical hot sauces. Cheesecake, there's a picture of a cheesecake my wife made. That's a chocolate chocolate papaya cheesecake. That's what the dark spots are, is chocolate. It was very good, with a and then of course pies, cream pies, custard pies. You can substitute pawpaw for banana in a custard or cream pies or custards, anything like that, or cheesecakes. It's the same, just one for one substitutions when you're using it in something like that. And then of course, it's easy to use pawpaw pulp in a smoothie. Mixing it in with yogurt works really well for that. But once again, it's this idea that it has this mild, complex flavor. And so we don't want to put it in with ingredients that are going to overshadow it. So we really get to taste that fantastic flavor. So markets. Currently, what do we have for markets? Well, we have the fresh market. There are people that really like pawpaws. There are also restaurants, particularly some of the higher end restaurants that like pawpaw as a seasonal fruit that they can bring in and make creations out of. Now, I told you that the fruit was perishable, but the good news is you can hold ripe fruit up to 3 weeks in the refrigerator. I hold it for 2 weeks on a regular basis, sometimes to get enough before I do any processing. So the refrigeration is good. It does work well with careful handling. As long as we don't drop the fruit and bruise it, it holds in the refrigerator very nicely. Frozen pulp, that's what I do because you certainly can't eat all of it at one time, and it works out quite well. And then I put down there at the bottom the idea of cottage food items. This idea of Illinois is expanding the number of food items that can now be sold as cottage food at fairs, crafts, and farmers markets. And so it may open up some new avenues for possibly pawpaws as well. So something that might be work in for pawpaws here as we move forward with some of our new cottage food laws that are going into effect this year. And so with that, do you have any questions? Because I see there's a few of you on here, so I'm sure there are.
Oh, we have plenty of questions for you, Doug, but thank you for that great presentation. So you'll notice that Grant shared a demographics poll on the screen. And so you're welcome to participate in that. It's just something that we use for program reporting. It is anonymous and it's not required. So if it's not something that you want to do, don't feel like you have to. But we'll go ahead and get started with some questions for you, Doug. So one of the questions is, do you have any recommended sources for newer hybrid trees? Which Bonnie, I think he answered that with his slide 6 and 7. And the presentation has been shared as well. So if you need to go back to that resource, that is available there. Right. Doug, did you have anything you needed to add?
No, the one thing I would add is that even though there are quite a few nurseries around the country that are growing out both the Kentucky State and the Neil Peterson new cultivars of pawpaw, the demand is quite high. I tried to order some in November and they were already sold out for spring. And so they go quickly. So this is something where you can't decide in January or March that you want to buy some of these new cultivars to put out this spring. They're gone. There aren't any. So I just keep that in mind when you're ordering, that these new cultivars are in high demand currently. And so the older varieties you can still find at this particular time, but the new ones, they have to be ordered in the summer.
So the next question is, what height tree tubes do you recommend?
What height tree do I recommend?
Tree tubes.
Oh, tree tubes. Okay, got it. Yes, the tree tubes, the tree shelters. Now this depends on your what you're protecting it from. But for me, with rabbits and voles, I use the 2 foot. I use the 2 foot. Sometimes the 3 feet. It depends what I can find. But I use either the 2 or the 3 foot shelter. Now, if you have a deer issue in your area and you're going to be putting out quite a few and then the deer are nearby, then you may want to go to a taller one just to protect them longer.
This next person is asking, what is the pawpaw market like?
The pawpaw market, it's a small market. It's a market that you have to develop. Word gets out and people who like pawpaws, they will buy them, they will like them. You sell them to people at a farmer's market or something, you're going to have to go with recipes and suggestions for how they're going to eat it, how they might eat it. Because once again, very few people, unless they're familiar with the pawpaw, know anything about this native fruit. Restaurants, Chicago, there is a market in Chicago. Once again, you have to make some contacts, but the restaurants in Chicago do use pawpaw when they can find a reliable supply. Because once again, when you go to a restaurant, they're going to take quite a few at one time.
Our next question is, what's the best way to harvest the fruit at 18 feet?
Well, a ladder. A lot of times, actually, my fruit's never up 18 feet in the air. Most of my fruit is within the 1 to 8 foot to 9 foot range, which is within my reach. But occasionally I do have to use a short ladder to go up and get some that's up 10 feet or so. I rarely have anything that's 12 feet off the ground. It just seems as though the leaves, the fruit isn't sheltered quite as much there. They let those big leaves help to keep the fruit from getting sun scalded. And so the fruit tends to be just kind of down towards the center 2/3 of the tree is where most of the fruit, you'll find most of the fruit. So I don't have any problem. As far as how do you tell when the fruit is ripe, that really, the only way that I've learned how to do it is by feel. I tried color. Color is not always a good indicator. It can be on some cultivars, but if you have multiple cultivars, a yellow color, if you wait for a yellow color, it'll never come on some cultivars. Where on others, when it turns yellow, you know it's ripe. But when it's ripe, they fall to the ground. I mean, they just release. And so I go out and I just use my hand and I put it under a cluster. And if one of the pawpaws breaks loose when I gently push up on the cluster, I know it's ripe. And so that's how I test for it. Because once again, when they hit the ground, they bruise and you have to use them immediately or else they're not really any good.
Next question is, do you recommend transplanting wild pawpaws? This person has a lot, but they're unable to get fruit because the critters beat them to it.
Wild pawpaws, you can plant wild pawpaws, but typically transplanting a pawpaw doesn't work well. From what I read in research and some of the reports out of Kentucky State University and some other places, they say they aren't very successful. It's better to use a seedling. I mean, if you find a new young seedling and you could get the entire root system kind of a thing, that will work. But as far as digging up an established pawpaw, as they said, a lot of times they're part of a root sucker. And so they're getting a lot of nourishment from other pawpaw trees nearby. And when you go to transplant that, they just don't have enough root system to support the tree.
Our next question is, do pawpaws have to be planted in pairs to pollinate, or are there any self-pollinating trees?
They can't, they will produce fruit alone, but it will be very, very little, which is some of the problem with pawpaws in the wild, because they tend to be clonal colonies from one tree that then sends up root suckers that continue to make this colony. And so it really is good to have pairs, to have cultivars, maybe even a couple of cultivars, just so we get a little bit of cross-pollination with the flies. And I've had no problem with pollination. There have been some people that have had issues with pollination and have to hand pollinate, which you can do. The flowers are quite large. You can easily hand pollinate. But I live out in the country and I have no problem with flies. No flies pollinating the trees. In fact, I never knew it was an issue until I started reading about it. That the flies do quite a good job if you live out away from the city. Now in the city, that might be an issue.
Are there any pesticidal properties in the skin of the fruit?
According to Purdue, they have derived some pesticidal properties from the skin. And at one time they were going to develop a pesticide, organic pesticide from it. And as far as I know, I don't think that ever came to pass. But at one time they had a project where they were going to develop organic insecticide from pawpaw skin, from what they could derive from pawpaw skin.
Are the new cultivars accomplished through only selection or through genetic manipulation?
There's crossbreeding. There is crossbreeding on the cultivars, and there's also selection. And so like the Shenandoah, it was a selection from a cross that the Peterson group made. And it's the same thing with Kentucky State. They do crossbreeding and then they select from the offspring and they've developed from there. Once again, selecting for large fruit, consistently larger fruit and smaller seed size.
This person is asking, do you think that the recent increases in pests could be related to the development of pawpaws with smaller seeds or monocultures?
No, actually, well, large planting of pawpaws will tend to bring in more issues, can tend to bring in more issues. But as far as the smaller seeds, no, there really hasn't been a problem. The Susquehanna and the Potomac do quite well. They don't have an issue. It just happens to be if you're in a spot, particularly with this new Asian beetle that's come in that we need to, Asian ambrosia beetle, that in some parts of the country, it is quite a problem. Here locally where I am, it is not, but I've understood that in some urban areas, it has been a problem. It has also been a problem for some nursery operations growing ornamental plants in Northeast Indiana and up in the Northern Illinois area. But once again, these are concentrated plantings, typically nurseries. We have lots of plants in a small area, and which is a little bit different than if you're going to plant pawpaws, unless you're going to plant, acres of pawpaws, in which case you might attract it, but then again, you may not. It is not a rampant problem yet. And it's only just reported casually because in Kentucky, they have noted it in a few places.
Can all cultivars be grown anywhere in our state, even in northern counties?
Northern counties, you're going to have to, once again, you're going to need a deep, well-drained, moist soil, or you're going to have to work it, come up with a way so you developed that deep, moist, well-drained soil. And so I know part of our northern counties, our soils aren't very deep. So that's why the rain, it typically doesn't range up there. But if you are in an area where you do have good, deep, well-drained soils, yes, they'll work fine. They're up with our warming trend. There are pawpaws in Wisconsin now.
Does the colander separate the pulp from the skin well?
No. No, and in fact, you don't use, no, you, once again, no skin. Only pulp goes into either the rotary screen and the food strainer, the Weston food strainer, sauce maker, or into a cone collar, because the skin is bitter tasting. And you just don't want to get the skin in there. It gives it a terrible off. You get to have a bad off flavor. It is not a pleasant, mild taste. So that is another issue with the processing is that we just can't throw it in there and get the pulp out and have the skin and seeds left behind, because unfortunately those big seeds will squeeze some of the skin through with the pulp.
Can the pulp be frozen?
Yeah, oh, yes, it freezes quite well. I freeze it in 2-cup quantities.
Do most of the fruits on a tree ripen at once, or is there a progression?
There is a progression. They will, as we have in a lot of fruit, there'll be the main body will ripen about the same time, but there'll be a few that are early and there'll be a few that are later. But when the main body ripens, you get quite a bit within a 1-week period. But there'll be a few ahead of that, there'll be a few later.
What is the average yield per tree?
From what they say, the average yield can vary up, can get up to 100 pounds, up to, wait a minute, no, let me rephrase that. You can get up to 20 to 40 pounds per tree. If you have a highly productive tree, you have it irrigated and you're fertilizing well. I get about 20 pounds off my trees, and that's a lot of fruit. That's a lot of fruit. So I obviously don't use all my pawpaws because I just have so many.
In a home setting, this person is trying to pick a planting site that allows for some shade while young, but full sun that it can grow into. How do you suggest picking planting sites to account for growth into full sun.
Yes, and something we need to remember is that we also remember those big leaves that are on this tree. They need a little protection from the wind because remember in nature they're an understory tree, and so if you're on a hilltop or somewhere that's subjected to a lot of strong wind, you may want to plant them in a place that's a little more protected, I have mine planted behind, between windbreaks in an open area I have, so they have some protection to the south and to the west and to the north. And for the west, it also helps with the late afternoon hot sun. That works out quite well. But also the idea with that new planting, you're going to have to give them, those young trees, a little shade, and it can be artificial shade and moisture to get them through those first couple years.
This person wants to know how to start trees from seeds.
Oh, well, the seed needs to go through a cold process, it, like it does in nature, and then they come right up. They come right up. That's how pawpaws spread all over the eastern half. A good portion of the eastern half of the United States was large animals depositing them after they ate them. They made their way across the countryside.
Is there a lab that will identify pawpaws? I'm guessing they want to know like a variety or a cultivar.
Oh, the cultivar, if you have wild trees, then you have wild trees. As far as cultivars, well, you would know that when you purchase them. But as far as knowing what they are, no. They all pretty much look pretty similar, the different cultivars. And so if you plant them, you just want to have some good records of where you plant what and what you plant where.
Can you eat fresh pawpaw without needing to process the pulp?
Oh, yes. Yes, yes. The Native Americans ate pawpaws all the time and ate it fresh, as well as yeah, always ate it fresh. And so yeah, all you need the spoon.
Any specific cultivars you would recommend for using in colder weather like Finger Lakes region of New York?
Ah, you're really pushing it up there, and that's we don't recommend pawpaws beyond growth zone 5. So if you're in growth zone 5, I think you'll be fine, because as I said, we now have pawpaws grown in Wisconsin because our growth zone 5 zone is now expanded up into Wisconsin. It used to be kind of along the northern edge of Illinois, and it's now into Wisconsin. So if you're in that type of growth zone, zone 5, USDA growth zone 5, then you should be all right as long as you got the well-drained, deep soil, deep moist soil. You have all those things, they should do just fine.
Do you have any recommendations to deter squirrel activity?
Squirrel activity? Is
Yeah.
that the question?
Uh-huh.
You have to get to them before the squirrels. And as far as deterring them, actually the biggest deterrent is just being present out there a lot. But no, as far as we can use, there are some deterrents that we can spray, that have an odor that will deter the animals from bothering them. But they once again have to be sprayed on a pretty regular basis, weekly or so, when the fruit begins to get ripe, because they wash off with any kind of a rain.
Are there any overwintering problems that can be experienced?
Yes. Pawpaws, as I mentioned, on my planting, they do like a sheltered location as we get into with the winter and the cold winds. And so this idea is they'll grow fine in our northern part of zone growth zone 5, but they shouldn't be in an exposed type of situation where they're experience rapid increases and decreases in temperature with that smooth bark, because it will split the bark. And so the idea is we want to kind of make sure that they've got a little wind block if they're the only thing out there in the wide open, so that they have some protection and they aren't subjected to harsh winter winds, the drying effect of harsh winter winds, as well as the sudden drops in temperature.
Are cultivars grown from seed or grafted?
Grafted.
Are there,
Most are grafted right now. All the new ones are grafted.
are there specific types of flies that pollinate pawpaws?
There are, but they tend to be the flies that we will find around decaying vegetation. And so because that's kind of the scent of the flower. And so there are a number of species of flies that do that, as well as a few beetles. And so, as I say, I've had no issue with it because I live out on the farm, and we always have leaves or something in some state of decay around the trees or something, and so the flies are there.
So this person saves seeds from big fruited pawpaws and plants the seeds, and they grow just fine. Are pawpaws true to seed?
Yes. Yes, they are true to seed, which is they're true to seed, and the new varieties are all cloned just so that they make sure that they are true, because they'll be true to seed, but if there's cross pollination, it may not be true to the tree that it came off of. You may have something new there.
If a new cultivar is planted near wild pawpaws, will the cultivar lose beneficial aspects through pollination with wild ones?
No.
What's the best companion tree for pawpaws?
Another pawpaw. But once again, that depends on what you're talking about. Now, if you're in a location that gets a lot of intense sunlight for long periods of time, then the idea of having some shade trees at a distance off to the west of your pawpaw, so that in the late afternoon it gets a little shade, can be helpful. It's not necessary. They tolerate full sun well. It's just the issue of as we get into our colder climates of the winter time and those sharp temperature changes.
Alrighty, so I think that is a wrap up. We're out of time now. So if you do have any further questions, you can reach out to Doug and ask him those questions. So I'd like to thank you, Doug, for your great presentation on pawpaw production. And I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. We will be sending out the webinar, or I guess we won't be sending it out, but it is going to be on the Illinois YouTube page, which you guys have received that link in previous emails for this webinar series. We hope to have today's recording out by tomorrow afternoon, so look for that. And with that, have a great day, and we'll see you next week for high tunnel winter green production. Thank you, everyone.